The Arlington National Cemetery stood in solemn reverence, the cold wind whispering through the sea of white headstones like ghosts murmuring their own elegies. The sky, an iron cast of gray, hung heavy over the gathering. The crowd, a silent congregation of military personnel and grieving families, had formed a disciplined line near the casket draped in the American flag. General Jonathan Gray stood at the forefront, his back straight as a steel rod, his face impassive beneath the brim of his peaked cap. He had spent decades perfecting the art of restraint. The medals across his chest glinted under the dim afternoon light, a silent testament to the battles he had fought, the men he had led, the soldiers he had buried. But today was different. Today he was not standing before a battalion. He was standing before the grave of a brother-in-arms, Major Thomas Reynolds. A widow clutched the folded flag against her chest, her sobs barely contained. The honor guard stood rigid, hands resting at their sides. The ceremony neared its conclusion. The bugle player took a breath, preparing for the first note of taps. And then it happened. A voice, sharp and commanding, shattered the sanctity of the moment. Hands in the air. No. For a fraction of a second, silence reigned. Then chaos unfurled. Heads turned. Gasps rippled through the crowd like a stone breaking the surface of still water. At the far end of the gathering, two uniformed police officers stood with weapons raised. The younger officer, barely past his rookie years, hesitated. His fingers twitched over the grip of his holstered gun. But the older one, Sergeant Tom Blake, stood firm, his stance wide, his hands steady on the trigger. The target of his aggression? General Gray, a decorated war hero, a man whose strategic brilliance had commanded entire battlefields, a man who had survived ambushes, explosions, and sniper fire. And now, on his own country's soil, at the burial of his closest friend, he was being held at gunpoint. Gray didn't move. The murmurs swelled into hushed outrage. Soldiers exchanged glances, instincts kicking in, only to realize they were unarmed for the ceremony. The widow let out a strangled cry. The bugle player, still frozen mid-breath, lowered his instrument. Blake's voice cut through the air like a whip. I said, hands up. Gray exhaled through his nose, his breath slow and controlled. He had been in worse situations, yet there was something different about this. A battlefield followed a code of war. This was arrogance. This was power misplaced, wielded recklessly. Finally he spoke. His voice was even, devoid of fear. What exactly do you think you're doing, Sergeant? Blake sneered, shifting his grip on the weapon. His uniform was tied around his broad shoulders, the glint of his badge catching the light. You're acting suspicious, sir. Gray's jaw tightened. Sir. The way Blake said it was dripping with something else. Contempt, mockery, not an ounce of real respect. Suspicious, Gray repeated, arching a brow beneath his cap. His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. Blake squared his stance, his face darkening. You were whispering near the casket, stepping too close. I need you to comply. The accusation was absurd. Gray had whispered a prayer, a simple prayer. He could have laughed if the situation weren't so grave. The younger officer, Lieutenant Stephen Holt, took an uneasy step forward. His eyes darted between Blake and Gray, and for the first time, his hesitation cracked through his mask of professionalism. Sergeant, stay out of this, Holt, Blake snapped, his voice sharp. Gray remained still. A slow, deliberate inhale. A measured exhale. The weight of the moment settled in his bones. Then, his next words were a whisper of steel. You are making the biggest mistake of your life. A hush fell over the cemetery. Holt visibly swallowed. Blake's lip curled. He took a step closer. The barrel of his gun barely lowered, but was enough for Gray to see the tension in his fingers. The officer was holding on to his authority like a drowning man clutching a lifeline. You think I don't know who you are? Blake's voice dropped to something almost conspiratorial. Big shot general, huh? Well, out here, you're just another man. Gray's expression remained unreadable. Blake thought he was in control. He had no idea what was coming. A ripple of disbelief ran through the funeral attendees as the weight of what was happening settled over them like a dense fog. A four-star general, one of the most decorated men in military history, was standing at gunpoint at his own comrade's funeral. The bitter winter air carried whispers between officers, each one processing the absurdity of the situation. General Jonathan Gray remained motionless. The rigid posture of his frame wasn't one of surrender, but of control. Every muscle in his body was coiled with silent tension, his mind analyzing the scene like a battlefield map. Years of experience had taught him that the most dangerous man in a fight wasn't the loudest one, but the calmest. Sergeant Tom Blake, however, was the opposite of calm. His knuckles whitened against the grip of his weapon. His jaw was set, his stance wide, a clear performance of dominance rather than protocol. He wanted compliance, yes, but more than that, he wanted to see the mighty fall. And he had chosen the wrong man. The soldiers standing nearby, bound by their training and their unarmed status, shifted uncomfortably. Some instinctively glanced toward the honor guard, their ceremonial rifles useless in this moment of crisis. The widow of Major Reynolds, still clutching the folded flag to her chest, let out a small, choked gasp. Gray let the silence stretch, using it as a weapon. He had seen men like Blake before, officers who mistook authority for superiority, who thrived on the illusion of power rather than its responsibility. They were dangerous, not because they were strong, but because they were blind to their own weakness. Blake, agitated by the lack of reaction, pressed forward. "I gave you an order, General," he barked, his voice cracking slightly under the weight of his own aggression. Gray didn't flinch. His presence alone made it feel as though Blake was the one being interrogated. "And I gave you a warning," Gray replied, his voice steady, devoid of fear. Blake exhaled sharply, his patience thinning. He turned slightly toward his younger partner, Lieutenant Stephen Holt, as if looking for reinforcement. But Holt wasn't so sure anymore. His eyes flickered from Gray to the watching crowd, realization sinking into his hesitant frame. This wasn't right. Blake sensed his doubt and bristled. He needed control. "I don't care what rank you hold," Blake snapped, straightening his grip. "You will do as I say, or—" Gray cut him off before he could finish. "Or what, Sergeant?" The words were a quiet challenge. Blake hesitated. It was subtle, just a flicker in his expression, a hesitation so small it might have gone unnoticed by an ordinary man. But Gray wasn't ordinary. He saw it. The crack in the foundation. Blake had expected compliance. He had expected the power dynamic to be in his favor. But instead, he was facing a man who had commanded entire battalions, orchestrated battlefield strategies, and walked through war zones where real threats lurked in the shadows. A man who did not fear him. And suddenly, for the first time, Blake felt it. Doubt. The murmuring crowd was growing restless. More people were reaching for their phones, their eyes filled with a mixture of shock and outrage. This wasn't a private power move anymore. This was a spectacle. Lieutenant Holt's breathing had quickened. He stole another glance at Blake, then back at the civilians watching. His hand twitched near his belt, not toward his weapon, but toward his radio. Gray saw that too. The younger officer was unraveling. He knew this was wrong. Gray's voice cut through the tension like a scalpel. "You're outnumbered, Sergeant." Blake's nostrils flared. He had the gun. He had the badge. And yet, the situation was slipping through his fingers like sand. Gray took a single step forward. It was deliberate, slow. The kind of movement that a predator makes when it knows its prey has already lost. The muscles in Blake's jaw tensed. The gun in his hand wavered just slightly, not enough to lower it, but enough to show the first sign of uncertainty. Gray's eyes locked onto Blake's, unwavering. "Tell me, Sergeant," he continued, his voice a shade lower, "what exactly do you think you are preventing here?" Blake opened his mouth, but no words came out, because there was nothing to say. Gray could see the storm brewing inside the officer's mind. The realization was setting in. He had no justification, no reason beyond his own bias, his own assumptions. He had seen a black man, dressed in military formality, standing in a position of reverence, and had immediately decided it was suspicious. He had made his move before even questioning his motives. And now he was trapped in his own mistake. Lieutenant Holt exhaled sharply, his shoulders rising and falling with a quiet decision. He took a step back away from Blake. Blake noticed. For the first time, a flash of something close to panic crossed his face. His own partner, the only other officer in uniform, was distancing himself. Gray didn't move. He didn't need to. The crowd was already turning against Blake. The soldiers who had once stood frozen in shock were beginning to shift, their outrage building. The weight of authority was tilting. and Blake was standing on sinking ground. Another sharp voice pierced the moment, not Gray's this time. "Sergeant Blake." It was a woman's voice, firm, sharp as steel. From the line of mourners stepped Colonel Margaret Wilson. Her uniform was pristine, her insignia undeniable. She carried the bearing of a woman who had seen men rise and fall under the sheer weight of their own arrogance. Blake turned toward her, and that was his second mistake. Because the second he acknowledged her presence, the truth became undeniable. He was surrounded by those who outranked him. Gray watched as Blake's fingers twitched against his weapon, his thoughts scrambling for an escape route that no longer existed. Colonel Wilson took another step forward. And then she said the words that made the entire cemetery hold its breath. "Do you have any idea who you just pointed your weapon at?" Blake's entire face changed. For the first time since this confrontation began, there was a visible tremor in his grip. He blinked once, twice. His lips parted, but he could not answer. Because now he understood. And he knew exactly how this was going to end. For a single, suffocating moment, silence reigned over the cemetery. Even the winter wind had ceased its restless stirring, as if the very air itself had frozen in the wake of Colonel Margaret Wilson's words. Sergeant Tom Blake stood rigid, his grip still locked around his firearm, though the certainty in his stance had begun to erode. His eyes, once filled with the overconfidence of unchecked authority, now flickered with something dangerously close to recognition. The weight of his mistake was beginning to settle upon him. Colonel Wilson's expression remained unreadable, but there was something in the way she held herself, a quiet, unyielding force that carried the gravitas of a woman who had spent her life shaping soldiers into warriors. She had seen men like Blake before, men who wielded power recklessly, believing themselves untouchable. Her voice, steady and sharp, broke the silence. "Do you understand what you've done?" The question was more than rhetorical. It was a statement of impending judgment, a warning wrapped in ice. Blake's throat bobbed in a dry swallow, but his mouth remained stubbornly shut. His mind scrambled for a justification, a way out, but none presented itself. The gun in his hand, a tool of control, of authority, suddenly felt heavier than it ever had before. Lieutenant Holt, standing just a few feet away, had already taken another step back. His body language screamed discomfort. His earlier hesitation had hardened into something more defined, the unmistakable look of a man who no longer wished to be on the wrong side of history. The gathered soldiers and officers, once bound by rigid discipline, were shifting. Their stances, their eyes, everything about their presence had changed. They were no longer bystanders. They were witnesses. And Blake was the one on trial. Across from him, General Jonathan Gray remained unmoved. If he felt vindication, he didn't show it. There was no need to gloat, no need to revel in the inevitable collapse of the man before him. He had fought in wars where life and death hung on the edge of a single mistake. He knew this was already over. Blake, however, wasn't ready to surrender. Not yet. He exhaled sharply through his nose, gripping onto what little authority he had left. His training, his instincts, his pride screamed at him to reassert control, to grasp at the remnants of the power slipping through his fingers. "I was securing the scene," he said finally, his voice tight, clipped. "I was ensuring protocol was followed." His words hung in the air, flimsy and weak, a shield riddled with cracks. Gray tilted his head slightly, watching the man grasp for an escape route that no longer existed. He knew that Blake didn't believe his own words. Wilson took another measured step forward, her boots crunching against the frostbitten earth. Her stare could have cut through steel. "Protocol," she echoed, her tone eerily calm. Blake flinched. "Tell me, Sergeant," she continued, "what protocol justifies holding a four-star general at gunpoint? What rulebook instructs you to escalate a situation at a military funeral?" Blake's lips pressed into a thin, bloodless line. He knew the answer. Everyone here knew the answer. There was no protocol, no justification, no excuse. There was only his assumption, only his bias. Gray finally moved, just a fraction, enough to subtly shift the balance of power. His gaze remained locked onto Blake, his presence a silent but undeniable force pressing down on the sergeant's already crumbling defense. The murmurs from the surrounding soldiers and officers had grown louder. Some spoke in hushed tones, others merely exchanged looks, but the effect was the same. Blake was losing control of the moment. Lieutenant Holt finally exhaled and reached for his radio. The small but decisive motion sent a shiver of realization through Blake's frame. This was no longer just an internal matter. This was about to become official. Blake's pulse pounded against his skull. He could feel the weight of the badge on his chest, once a symbol of authority, now an anchor pulling him deeper into a situation he no longer commanded. For the first time, true panic crept into his features. He opened his mouth, but the words refused to come. What could he say? That he had made a mistake? That he had judged a man by the color of his skin before the stars on his shoulders? That he had allowed his ego to blind him to the reality of the moment? The truth loomed over him, undeniable and crushing. Wilson took one last step forward, her voice dropping to a near whisper, but it cut deeper than any shout could. You didn't see a general today, Sergeant. Blake's breath hitched. You didn't see a man who has commanded thousands, who has bled for this country, who has sacrificed more than you could possibly understand. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. You saw a black man standing where you thought he shouldn't be, and you decided that was enough. Blake's entire body went rigid. The gathered soldiers no longer just watched. They judged. The reality was laid bare before them, an unspoken truth, now spoken aloud for all to hear. There was no more hiding behind authority, no more pretending this was about duty. This had been about power, and Blake had abused it. Gray still hadn't moved beyond his initial step forward, but his presence alone commanded the moment. His voice, when it finally came, was quiet, unshaken, final. Lower your weapon, Sergeant. Blake's fingers trembled. A second stretched into eternity, and then finally the gun lowered. Not willingly, not gracefully, but inevitably, because there was no other choice left. The moment the barrel dipped, it was over. A harsh breath left Blake's lungs, his shoulders slumping as if the realization had physically drained him. The weight of his own actions pressed down on him like a tidal wave, and he was drowning. Lieutenant Holt wasted no time. He spoke into his radio, his voice steady now, as if the moment had finally granted him the courage to act, requesting immediate senior oversight at Arlington. Officer intervention needed. The final nail in the coffin. Blake turned, as if searching for an ally, someone, anyone who might still be on his side. But there was no one. The widow of Major Reynolds stared at him, eyes red-rimmed from grief, but filled with something else now. Disgust. The soldiers and officers watched in silent condemnation. Colonel Wilson stood firm, her expression unreadable. And General Gray? He simply watched, because there was nothing more to say. Blake had spoken enough, and now the consequences would speak for him. The silence after Lieutenant Holt's radio call was deafening. The weight of reality pressed into Sergeant Tom Blake's chest like an anchor, pulling him down into the cold, inescapable abyss of his own actions. He had made a mistake. Grave one. The gun, though now lowered, still felt seared into his palm, the heat of his own arrogance and recklessness refusing to fade. It had been meant as a tool of power, but now in his hands, it felt more like evidence. The gathered officers and soldiers stood frozen in a tableau of disbelief. The funeral had been a sacred space, a moment of solemn respect for a fallen soldier. Yet Blake had desecrated it with his own unchecked authority. The widow, standing just beyond the coffin, still clutched the folded flag as if it were the last fragile thread connecting her to the man she had lost. She wasn't crying anymore. She was staring at Blake, not with sorrow, with something closer to contempt. Blake swallowed hard. He could feel the shift in the air, the tide pulling against him. Where before he had commanded the moment, now he was at its mercy. His presence had become a stain on the honor of this gathering, and no one was willing to stand beside him. Lieutenant Holt stood stiffly, his radio still in hand, his knuckles pale with tension. He had made his choice, stepped out from the shadow of his partner's authority, and now he could only wait for the inevitable. Blake turned slightly, his gaze flicking toward General Jonathan Gray. The man still hadn't moved much, hadn't needed to. He stood like a monument, an immovable force in the face of Blake's crumbling foundation. The general's expression remained unreadable, his features set in stone, cold, unwavering, disappointed. That was the worst part. Not anger, not rage, disappointment. Blake had encountered fury before. He could handle aggression, could fight back against it. But this quiet condemnation, It was suffocating. A sharp noise shattered the silence, a crackling response from Holt's radio. Copy that. Senior command en route. Stand by. Blake exhaled slowly, a cold realization settling over him. There was no escape from this. The crowd was no longer murmuring in confusion or outrage. They were watching. Each second felt like a nail hammered deeper into the coffin of his career. Blake forced his shoulders back, instinctively straightening, trying to summon what little control he had left. If he was going down, he needed to hold on to something, anything. His gaze snapped back to Gray. I didn't know who you were. The words slipped from his mouth before he could fully process them, and he hated how weak they sounded. Gray's response was immediate, measured. You didn't need to. That was it. The final blow. Because that was the truth, wasn't it? This had never been about protocol or security. It had never been about safety or precaution. It had been about power. Blake had seen a man in uniform and had made an assumption. The wrong one. He had let his own bias dictate his actions, let it override rational thought, let it fuel his sense of entitlement. And now he was drowning in the consequences. The sound of approaching footsteps made his stomach twist. Senior officers, wearing the insignias of military law enforcement, moved toward the group with precision, their faces unreadable but their purpose unmistakable. Blake's pulse pounded in his ears. This was it. One of the officers, a stern-faced major with cold eyes, assessed the situation with a practiced glance. His gaze flicked between the soldiers, the grieving civilians, and finally, the man at the center of it all. Blake. Sergeant, the major said, his voice level but firm, place your weapon on the ground. Blake hesitated. Just for a second. But even that second was too much. Lieutenant Holt's voice, softer but just as resolute, followed. Just do it. Blake's fingers twitched. The weight of the gun seemed unbearable now. Slowly, with measured movement, he crouched down, setting his weapon on the frozen ground. The moment it left his grip, so did everything else. His authority, his status, the thin, fragile illusion of power he had wielded just moments ago. It was all gone. Another officer stepped forward, pulling a pair of handcuffs from his belt. Blake let out a shaky breath, but he didn't resist as his wrists were pulled behind his back. He had always believed that authority made him untouchable, that the badge gave him the right to dictate the narrative. Now he was just another man facing the consequences of his choices. Gray watched as it all unfolded, unmoving, his face unreadable. Wilson, however, spoke. Actions have consequences, Sergeant. Blake didn't respond, because what was there left to say? His career was over. His name, once just another among many, would now be remembered for this. The officers moved to escort him away, but just before he was led off, Blake turned his head slightly, eyes flicking toward Gray one last time. And what he saw was worse than anything he could have imagined. No hatred, no gloating, just the quiet, undeniable weight of a man who had seen this happen before and knew it would happen again. Blake dropped his gaze, because he knew too. And that knowledge burned more than anything else. The crowd remained silent as he was led away, the heavy footsteps of the officers the only sound against the cemetery's stillness. Gray finally exhaled, his breath visible in the cold air. Then, with slow, deliberate movement, he turned back toward the coffin, toward the man they were here to honor. The folded flag still rested in the widow's trembling hands. And the funeral, at long last, continued. The cemetery returned to its solemn silence as the last echo of footsteps faded. The air remained thick with tension, a quiet aftermath settling over the crowd. Sergeant Tom Blake had been led away, his hands bound, his authority stripped. But the weight of what had just transpired did not leave with him. General Jonathan Gray remained standing, unmoved, his eyes fixed on the polished wood of the casket before him. It was an unsettling contrast, the man who had just been held at gunpoint now standing motionless, while the man who had drawn the weapon had been escorted away in disgrace. The gathered soldiers and mourners stood in rigid stillness, their faces a mixture of quiet outrage and contemplative silence. What had begun as a tribute to a fallen hero had been tainted, overshadowed by the arrogance of one man. Yet, even in the stillness, something had changed. The tension in the air had not dissipated. It had simply shifted. What had started as shock had transformed into something else, a quiet reckoning. Gray inhaled deeply, the cold air burning his lungs. He had not planned for this, But he was not surprised. He had seen it before. Different faces, different places, but the same story. A man with a badge and too much certainty. A moment of unchecked power. A decision made in arrogance rather than reason. The outcome had always been the same. Only this time, it had played out in front of an audience that could not ignore it. Across from him, Colonel Margaret Wilson remained still, her sharp gaze sweeping over the faces of those gathered. She had been in this position before, had witnessed men unravel under the weight of their own prejudice. But something about today had left an unease even she could not shake. Lieutenant Stephen Holt stood a few steps away, his posture stiff, his face pale. He had done the right thing in the end, but the hesitation in his eyes told a different story. He had waited too long. Blake was gone, but the stain of his actions remained. The funeral should have ended by now, but no one moved. No one spoke. The widow of Major Thomas Reynolds still clutched the folded flag to her chest, her fingers trembling. She had lost her husband to war, only to have his final moments of honor disrupted by a display of misplaced authority. And now she simply stood, the weight of it all pressing into her thin frame. Gray finally moved. It was not a grand gesture, not a speech, not an attempt to reclaim the moment. Instead, he simply took a slow step forward and placed his hand atop the casket. A single touch, a gesture that said everything. He had fought alongside Thomas Reynolds. He had led him into battle, had seen the fire in his eyes as they faced enemies together. And now, in the final moment of farewell, he would not let this moment be overshadowed by the ignorance of a single man. He whispered something under his breath, something only the dead could hear. A final goodbye. The soldiers around him straightened instinctively, their hands tightening at their sides. The bugler, who had hesitated before, now lifted his instrument once more. The first mournful note of taps rang through the cemetery, cutting through the heavy air like a blade. One by one, the soldiers resumed their positions. Despite the interruption, despite the spectacle that had unfolded before them, the ceremony would continue. Because this was not about Sergeant Tom Blake. It never had been. This was about a soldier who had given his life for his country, and nothing would take that away from him. The ceremony concluded without another disruption. The final respects were paid, hands were raised in solemn salute, and the casket was lowered into the earth. But the weight of what had occurred did not leave when the funeral ended. As the mourners slowly began to depart, conversations whispered through the crisp air, words exchanged in hushed, uncertain tones. What had happened today would not be forgotten. Gray walked toward his car, his steps measured, his mind already shifting ahead. He had dealt with conflict his entire life, on battlefields, in strategy rooms, in situations where the wrong decision could mean the difference between life and death. But this fight was different. He had not faced an enemy today. He had faced a failure of the very system he had sworn to defend. And that, perhaps, was the heaviest burden of all. Wilson caught up to him, her expression as unreadable as ever. She did not ask if he was all right. They both knew that was a pointless question. Instead, she simply walked beside him in silence for a moment before finally speaking. There will be fallout from this. Gray let out a breath. I know. She nodded, as if confirming something to herself. It won't go unnoticed. Gray didn't respond immediately. He knew what she meant. What had happened today had been seen. By soldiers. By officers. By civilians who had pulled out their phones and recorded the moment Blake had made his mistake. The world did not look away from moments like this anymore. And that meant there would be consequences. Not just for Blake, but for everyone. 3 days later, the news broke. Sergeant Tom Blake officially dismissed from duty following internal investigation. Unlawful use of force under review. Will he face charges? The headlines filled the screens, spreading like wildfire. The footage had gone viral. The image of Blake holding a gun on a 4-star general at a funeral had ignited outrage, had sparked debates, had forced those in power to respond. And the response was swift. Blake had been relieved of duty within 48 hours. His record would be scrutinized, his history re-examined. Gray watched the news without emotion. Justice had been served, not because of an order, not because of power, but because truth had done the work itself. As he clicked off the screen, he exhaled softly, staring at the darkened reflection in the glass. There would be another Blake, another moment, another test of the system. But for today, this battle was won. And that was enough. For now. The news spread like wildfire, unstoppable in its reach. The image of Sergeant Tom Blake standing rigid, weapon in hand, staring down a four-star general at a funeral, had burned itself into the public consciousness. Screens flickered with his face, frozen in that moment of arrogance and failure. Headlines dissected his downfall with relentless scrutiny. Military funeral interrupted by armed officer. Who was the real threat? Sergeant Tom Blake relieved of duty after unlawful use of force. A career destroyed in seconds, the fallout of a misjudged decision. Blake's name was no longer his own. It had become a symbol, a cautionary tale, a warning of what happened when unchecked power was wielded recklessly. His badge had been stripped from him. His gun confiscated. His career ended with a single moment of poor judgment. The system that once shielded him now scrutinized him, turning him into an example. Yet, despite all the consequences, despite the weight of disgrace now hanging around his neck like an iron chain, Blake was not in a cell. Not yet. For now, he sat in a cold, windowless interrogation room, the stale air pressing against his skin. The walls were gray, unfeeling, much like the eyes of the internal affairs officers seated across from him. A digital recorder sat on the table, its red light blinking, marking every second that passed. One of the officers, a man with tired eyes and a perfectly pressed uniform, leaned forward, fingers laced together. He had the look of someone who had seen too many men in Blake's position before. "Tell us, Sergeant," he said, his voice flat and motionless. "At what point did you realize who you were pointing a gun at?" Blake swallowed, his throat dry. He could feel the weight of the room pressing down on him. Every decision, every moment of hesitation, every instinct that had led him here was now under the microscope. He had made a mistake. A terrible, irreversible mistake. But admitting that was something else entirely. He glanced down at his hands, calloused, strong, hands that had once symbolized control, authority. Now they were clenched into fists, resting on the cold steel of the interrogation table. He had never thought much about power until he lost it. And now, all that was left was the hollow realization of what he had done. Elsewhere, General Jonathan Gray sat in his office, his fingers steepled, his expression unreadable as he watched the news unfold. He had avoided the media, refused to comment, knowing that this story did not need his voice. The truth had spoken for itself. Yet, the weight of it all still sat heavy on his chest. This was not the first time he had seen this happen. And it would not be the last. Gray had spent his entire career fighting battles, some on foreign soil, some in meeting rooms where the stakes were just as high. He had lost men, had led men, had buried men. And still, after all these years, he was reminded of the simple, painful truth. Some fights never end. There would always be another Blake. Another moment of recklessness. Another man who saw only what he wanted to see. And there would always be consequences. A sharp knock on the door pulled him from his thoughts. Colonel Margaret Wilson stepped inside, her expression as controlled as ever, though there was something in her eyes, a quiet storm, restrained but dangerous. She didn't waste time on pleasantries. "They're pushing for full charges," she said. "Internal Affairs isn't going to let this slide." Gray studied her for a moment before exhaling slowly. And Wilson hesitated. "And it's going to be ugly." Gray leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking under his weight. He had expected this. Blake had humiliated himself in front of too many witnesses, too many cameras, too many people who weren't going to forget. The system was moving fast, not because it wanted to, but because it had to. This was not just about Blake anymore. This was about accountability, about public trust, about sending a message. Wilson crossed her arms, her gaze sharp. "They want him behind bars." Gray didn't react, though something flickered in his eyes. Justice had been served in the way the system allowed it to be. But was it enough? He knew how this would end. Blake would fight, lawyers would be called, the media would twist the narrative into something palatable, something safer. And the world would move on. But not before leaving a scar. Wilson sighed, glancing toward the muted television screen in Gray's office, where a news anchor continued to dissect every detail of the case. This story isn't going away. Gray didn't look at the screen. He didn't need to. He already knew. Blake sat in the interrogation room for hours, the weight of his choices pressing down on him like a collapsing building. There was no way out of this. No badge to protect him. No department to shield him. No authority left to wield. He was on the other side of the table now. And for the first time in his life, he understood what that truly meant. Time had a way of stretching in moments like these. Sergeant Tom Blake sat motionless in the sterile, windowless interrogation room, the harsh fluorescent light overhead casting a sickly glow on his already pale face. The room was void of anything comforting. No distractions, no illusions of power. Just cold steel, gray walls, and the weight of his choices pressing down on him like an avalanche. The silence was thick, suffocating. The two internal affairs officers seated across from him remained still, their faces unreadable. Their eyes, however, were sharp, watching him, waiting for something, an admission, a justification, anything. But Blake had nothing to give them. He had spent years believing he was untouchable, that the badge he wore gave him an unshakable right to dictate control over others. He had never questioned his authority because no one had ever forced him to. Until now. Until him. The image of General Jonathan Gray standing before him, unflinching, unshaken, unwavering, burned itself into his mind like an old war wound. The way the man hadn't even blinked in the face of Blake's weapon. The way the power had shifted, not with force, not with anger, but with truth. That was the moment Blake had lost. Not when the other officers had stepped in. Not when the handcuffs had locked around his wrists. Not when the headlines had spread across every news network like wildfire. He had lost the second he realized he had been wrong. And there was no undoing that. One of the internal affairs officers, a man with graying temples and a voice devoid of emotion, finally leaned forward. "We have enough evidence to proceed with formal charges." The words weren't a threat. They weren't a warning. They were a sentence. Blake exhaled slowly, pressing his palms flat against the cold steel table. He knew it was coming, even if part of him still clung to the fading remnants of control. Abuse of power. Unlawful use of force. Reckless endangerment. Words that once meant nothing to him now defined him. The officer continued. "Your dismissal from the force is final. You will be formally charged in the coming weeks." A long pause followed, heavy and deliberate. "Do you have anything to say for yourself?" Blake's jaw clenched. Did he? Did he have an excuse that could wash away what he had done? Did he have an argument that could shift the blame away from himself? He had spent years convincing himself that he was always in the right, that he knew best, that his instincts were sharper than others, that his judgment was above scrutiny. But none of that mattered anymore. He finally shook his head. No, it was barely above a whisper, but it was the truest thing he had ever said. The officer nodded, almost as if he had expected it. "Then we're done here." The recording light on the table clicked off. The interrogation was over. But for Blake, this was just the beginning of the end. General Jonathan Gray watched the news unfold from the quiet of his office. The coverage had not slowed. If anything, it had intensified, expanding beyond Blake and into a larger conversation, one about abuse of authority, about consequences, about how one moment of unchecked power could unravel an entire career. It was not the first time he had seen such discussions emerge, and it would not be the last. But this time, something was different. This time, the man at the center of it all had not walked away with nothing more than a slap on the wrist. This time, there had been accountability. He knew it would not fix everything. One man facing consequences did not undo the harm caused by countless others who had wielded power without responsibility. But it was something. A beginning. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. Colonel Margaret Wilson entered, her uniform crisp, her posture as straight as ever. But her expression carried a weight that even she could not entirely hide. She didn't sit. She simply stood, studying Gray for a moment before speaking. "He's been officially charged." Gray nodded once. He had expected it. Wilson crossed her arms. "You're not satisfied." It wasn't a question. Gray exhaled, leaning back slightly in his chair. "I've seen this before." Wilson raised a brow. And Gray's gaze remained steady. One case doesn't change a system. The truth sat between them, unspoken but undeniable. Blake would be punished. His career was over. He would likely serve time. But that didn't mean there wouldn't be another Blake. It didn't mean that another officer on another day wouldn't make the same decision, wouldn't pull a weapon on a man simply because he didn't fit the image of authority they expected. Wilson studied him for a long moment before finally speaking. No, it doesn't. They both knew that. But they also knew that moments like this, small as they were in the grand scale of history, mattered. Because they forced people to see. And once something had been seen, it could not be unseen. Wilson straightened. You did the right thing, Gray. Gray didn't answer. Not because he disagreed, but because he wasn't sure that one right thing was ever enough. 3 weeks later, the trial of Tom Blake began. The courtroom was packed, journalists filling every available seat, cameras rolling from every angle. The prosecution laid out their case with precision, using Blake's own body cam footage against him. The moment he raised his gun, the moment he dismissed his partner's hesitation, the moment he refused to lower his weapon, even when he knew he was wrong. The jury deliberated for less than an hour. The verdict was swift. Guilty. Blake barely reacted. He sat still, his face unreadable, as the judge handed down the sentence. 5 years. 5 years stripped of the authority he had once wielded so carelessly. 5 years to sit in a cell and think about the choices that had brought him there. Gray did not attend the sentencing. He did not need to, because this had never been about vengeance. It had been about accountability. And for once, justice had spoken. But even as the world moved on, as the news cycle shifted, as Blake faded into the background, Gray knew one thing with absolute certainty. There would be another. There would always be another. And the fight for justice? It was never over.